Okay.
Okay, please go ahead.
All right. I'm going to be talking about Wittgenstein and Spencer Brown. The title of this talk is Laws of Form is the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus Through the Looking Glass. So I'm going to begin with Wittgenstein and a discussion of the Tractatus. And I have a lot of quotes from the Tractatus because I wanted to remind us and give us a flavor of how that shapes up. And just a minute, I want to put this on slideshow or full screen. There, I think that's better. Right, and I may decide to skip some of these quotes because I don't want to go taking up all your time with them. But here is the outline of the Tractatus. These are the 7 basic propositions. At that level, it looks very simple. Deceptively simple. And if you were imagining writing an essay with these headers, you might not enter into the kind of depth that Wittgenstein did when he wrote it. But let's look at these. Number 1, it begins in the world. Well, the world is everything that is the case. Then what is the case? A fact, a tatsacha, is the existence of states of affairs. A logical picture of facts is a thought. A thought is a proposition with a sense. A proposition is a truth function and now it starts to sound like logic. A proposition is a truth function of elementary propositions. An elementary proposition is a truth function of itself. The general form of a truth function is some symbolism, but that symbolism actually means it is not that, it is not that, nor it is that, nor is it that, nor is it that. And in the end, you have said what you said by a combination of negations. What we cannot speak over, we must pass over in silence. That's the form of the book as a whole. Let's look at how that shapes up in actuality as we go into the book. The world is everything that is the case. The world is the totality of facts, not things. You'll notice how it goes, numbered, right? So there's number 1 of the 7, and then subheadings in there, and we'll see that. I'm not reading the whole book to you. I'm just reading some favorite parts that I think give a feel. The facts in logical space are the world. What is the case is the existence of atomic facts. The possibility of its occurrence in atomic facts is the form of an object, and you have arrived at the notion of form. 2 objects of the same logical form are, apart from their external properties, only differentiated from one another in that they are different, and we have arrived at distinction or difference. For if a thing is not distinguished by anything, I cannot distinguish it, for otherwise it would be distinguished. The form is the possibility of structure. The structure of a fact consists of the structures of atomic facts, and the totality of the existence of atomic facts is the world, when we return to the world. In the picture and the pictured, there must be something identical in the order that one can be a picture of the other at all. And we begin to get that picture theory of reality of his that is coming strongly in as we see. What the picture must have in common with reality in order to be able to represent it after its manner, rightly or falsely, is its form of representation. Picture, form, representation. The picture represents is its sense. In the agreement or disagreement of its sense with reality, truth or falsity consists. It cannot be discovered from the picture alone, whether it is true or false. And the incompleteness, that whereof you cannot speak must remain silent, is beginning to come in now. You're going to see indications of incompleteness along with what you can say as it goes along. There is no picture which is a priori true. The logical picture of the facts is the thought. Objects I can only name. Signs represent them. I can only speak of them. I cannot assert them. A proposition can only say how a thing is, not what it is. The sign is the part of the symbol perceptible by the senses. And at this point, he is saying that there's something not perceptible. Two different symbols can therefore have the same sign. The meaning of a sign ought never to play a role. And Russell, that's too much to go into. The thought is the significant proposition. The totality of propositions is the language, and we've reached language. And that, however, the signs P and not P can say the same thing is important, for it shows that the sign, negation, corresponds to nothing in reality. Here, there is going to be a turnaround that point when we get to Spencer Brown, for it will not be the case in the same way that a negation sign corresponds to nothing in reality. The object of philosophy is the logical clarification of thoughts. Philosophy is not a theory, but an activity. A philosophical work consists essentially of elucidations. Everything that can be thought at all can be thought clearly. Propositions cannot represent the logical form. The incompleteness again. This mirrors itself in the propositions. That which mirrors itself in language, language cannot represent. That which expresses itself in language, we cannot express by language. The propositions show the logical form of reality. They exhibit it. What can be shown cannot be said. And then he undertakes how values can be obtained from atomic values, from simpler values, and invents his version of truth tables, which indeed is the version of truth tables that we use today. And it's all laid out in there. Propositions are truth functions of elementary propositions. In no way can an inference be made from the existence of one state of affairs to another. There is no causal nexus which justifies such an inference. Events of the future cannot be inferred from those of the past, present. Superstition is the belief in the causal nexus. You can hear him talking to Kant. How can the all-embracing logic which mirrors the world use such special catches and manipulations, the formalities, the negation signs, only because all these are connected into an infinitely fine network to the great mirror? The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. As we go up in the propositions, he says lots of things that can't be said, as you see. The world and life are one. I am my world. The subject does not belong to the world, but it is the limit of the world. Where in the world is the metaphysical subject to be noted? Everything we see could be otherwise. Everything we describe at all could be otherwise. There is no order of things a priori. He's talking to Kant. The general form of the truth function, now we get to 6, the general form of a truth function is given in terms of it is not that. I won't say more. Logic is not a theory, but a reflection of the world. Logic is transcendental. The identity of the meaning of two expressions cannot be asserted. For in order to be able to assert anything about their meaning, I must know their meaning. And if I know their meaning, I know whether they mean or not. If there were a law of causality, it might run there are natural laws, but that cannot be said. It shows itself. At the basis of the whole modern view of the world lies the illusion that the so-called laws of nature are explanations of natural phenomena. The sense of the world must lie outside the world. Ethics cannot be expressed. The world of the happy is quite another than that of the unhappy. The world must wax and wane as a whole. How the world is completely indifferent for what is higher. God does not reveal himself in the world. Not how the world is the mystical, but that it is. The contemplation of the world sub specie eternity is its contemplation as a limited whole. The feeling that the world is a limited whole is the mystical feeling. For an answer which cannot be expressed, the question too cannot be expressed. The riddle does not exist. If a question can be put at all, then it can also be answered. The solution to the problem of life is seen in the vanishing of the problem. There is indeed the inexpressible. It shows itself. It is the mystical. My propositions are illusory in that he who understands me recognizes them as senseless. When he has climbed out through them, on them, over them, he must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up on it. He must surmount these propositions. Then he sees the world rightly. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. And you see that movement from the world and an attempt to describe the world out into what can be done with language, what is possible with language from his point of view then, and eventually it takes him over what, and he has to talk about what can't be done with language in that beautiful poetic way up to the end. And finally, the proposition which was always there at the beginning, one whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. That's the Tractatus, or one quick run through the Tractatus. And we can go through the looking glass here and find ourselves in Laws of Form. Laws of Form by G. Spencer Brown begins with what cannot be said in the form of the opening lines of the Tao Te Ching. The opening lines of the Tao Te Ching are a speaking of what cannot be said, of course. It's a poem. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. I don't need to read the rest of it, except to remind you that it does say darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding. Now, this is the beginning of a review of Laws of Form written by G. Spencer Brown under the pen name of James Keyes. It's a very good review. He had apparently read the book. An account of the emergence of physical archetypes presented as a rigorous essay in mathematics starts from the metaphysical or the non-physical or what cannot be said and gets to the physical. Starting with nothing and making one mark, we trace first of all the eternal forms. From these we obtain two axioms and proceed from here to develop theorems. The word angel, as we find, if we look it up, means messenger, and the algebraic consequences that spring from any mathematical system are always the angels through which the mathematics, which is basically structured in the eternal regions, may be interpreted or applied in everyday life. In this particular system, the consequences enable us to construct logic and to build computers. They turn out to be, in other words, the principles underlying Boolean algebra. It thus appears that accounts of the creation of the world from Genesis back to yin-yang and beyond turn out to be more or less evident, if incomplete, accounts of certain fundamental properties of Boolean mathematics. The book begins with chapter 1, the form. And here far from near the beginnings of the Tractatus, where form occurs also. So it's not like it just gets reversed in time and opens up. The same concepts are happening, but from a different point of view, perhaps, and not so different. We take as given the idea of distinction and the idea of indication, and that we cannot make an indication without drawing a distinction. We take, therefore, the form of distinction for the form. And then a little later, let a state distinguished by the distinction be marked with a mark. And this is the first time a sign occurs, and that sign itself makes a distinction. And then a calculus emerges out of that, and I do not want to go into the details of why you take these particular rules, but you might note that if you named something twice, it could be regarded as saying the name only once. And something fitting into itself can vanish. And then an algebra, and then work with that, where you can think of the that and the not that as happening across the boundaries of the distinction, either within or without the symbolism. And in general, a content is where we have marked it. And a mark is not inside the boundary shaping its form, but outside the boundary shaping another form, describing a form and a succession. And this is symbolism which shows itself. And there is no exact differentiation between the showing itself and the symbolism itself. We are not in a mirror picture of the world. We are in a picture of a world emerging out of no saying. And eventually, a calculus of distinctions is constructed, and from it, an algebra, and then logic and propositional logic emerge from that, and truth tables, very beautiful truth tables using this kind of calculus, which we won't go into. And then temporality in the sense of recursion and self-reference, so that one might find oneself oscillating between a marked state or an unmarked state, or examining a more complex kind of oscillation as values are shot through the space generated by the pattern of a form and then you get something like this kind of language from which it is admitted from an infinitely extended expression comes a potentially endless emission. And we can arrange the properties in a space so that emissions and transmissions will occur. And such wave trains, although recognizable, might be considered as simplified precursors of what we take in physical science to be the real thing. And the world is emerging now, in his way of describing, from the considerations that started from very little. Even so, their accuracy and coverage is astounding. Think of standing waves and observing, and it begins to sound a little like physics. The progression has been from the unstable through the possibility of distinction to precursors for time and things and their processes. And you will find this passage, which I'll read just a little, about it is amazing. We cannot escape the fact that the world we know is constructed in order and thus in such a way as to be able to see itself. Not so much in view of what it sees, although this may appear fantastic enough, but in respect to the fact that it can see it all. But in order to do so, it must first cut itself up into at least one state which sees and at least another state which is seen. And in this condition, whatever it sees is only partially itself. And here again this is almost a rephrasing of Wittgenstein's incompleteness. In the saying, in the distinguishing, in the seeing, it becomes incomplete. We may take it that the world undoubtedly is itself, indistinct from itself, but in any attempt to see itself as an object, it must equally undoubtedly act so as to make itself distinct from and therefore elude itself. It seems hard to find an acceptable answer to the question of how or why the world conceives a desire and discovers an ability to see itself and appears to suffer the process. That it does so is sometimes called the original mystery. Perhaps in view of the form in which we presently take ourselves to exist, the mystery arises from our insistence on framing a question when there is in reality nothing to question. This paragraph could have been done as an exercise in how something is shown through language, propositionally or otherwise, because if you were to read, and he must have done this deliberately, only the italics, you read, the form we take to exist arises from framing nothing. In this conception, a distinction is drawn in any space as a mark, distinguishing the space. Equally and conversely, any mark in a space draws a distinction. And the last lines of the book. The last lines. We see now that the first distinction, the mark, and the observer are not only interchangeable, but in the form identical. And while that doesn't tell you that you can't speak, it directs you right back to the beginning where there was nothing to say. So that's my very fast comparison of Wittgenstein and Spencer Brown, and I wanted to give you a sense of both of them and how they feel in this talk. I'll stop there.
But what would be the conclusion that Les Brown, Spencer Brown, finally will say to the room?
That what we take to be knowledge of the world is the knowledge of the distinctions that we have been able to make, or think that we can make, that our world is composed of those distinctions. But again, that there is more than that, and that there's always more than that.
So what kind of audience or what kind of the user that will be benefited from that standpoint?
Well, if you are, it depends on what you regard as a benefit, of course. Any distinction has value. So you, in looking at your particular situation, whatever it might be, maybe you're a designer of artificial intelligence, then for you, a benefit would be that the artificial intelligence would behave better. Maybe you're a person who would like to see peace in the world, and then you confront the problem of how could events move in the direction of peace. Depends on what your value is when you ask what is the use or the benefit. But the wide use or benefit of this is to have your attention directed to the fact that whatever you are looking at, whatever benefit or use you have in mind, you have to look and see what is that benefit and what does it mean in the context of your living. Now, there are ways to calculate here, but and those ways to calculate give you benefits of another kind, right? Of a mathematical kind. I may wish to calculate whether a certain sentence is true or false on the basis of the values of its parts, and then you have a mathematical technique which is useful. So I'm pushing the question back to you, of course, in a way, but not entirely. I'm saying that if you ask for the use of it, it's of great general use because use itself and value are what it's about.
Yeah. How do you apply this to the current situation happening in Israel?
Yeah, I'd like to know. But
I
you
mean,
notice,
you have to
let's consider,
let us know.
but let's consider that for a moment. You will find editorials written in your mind almost immediately, and many of them you see them, you read the paper and you say, oh yes, that editorial is exactly what I was thinking, right? And those editorials are along the lines of, well, what do they do next? If the Israelis come down and just destroy the Gaza, then we're in a terrible tragedy because the situation then will be worse for 1,000 years. And yet, how can they not? And people have to, even in the rush of these events, start to think about what kind of distinction am I making between myself and these others, and what am I doing with them? That has to be looked at. And we know that if all those leaders could look enlightenedly enough, the whole thing could just stop. We know that. But I don't have an algorithm. And I don't think Spencer Brown or Wittgenstein have an algorithm. Wittgenstein wrote this in the midst of World War I. It's the same passion for trying to come to some sense of how the world is for us that can show itself in a way that would lead to real usefulness.
Boris, you raised your hand.
You asked me.
Yeah, I saw you wave your hand a moment ago.
No, I'm just feeling uncomfortable. I have one question for Luis. I hope we are all friends. Luis, can you tell me in 2-3 sentences what we're talking about? There are so many terms that I'm not.
Yeah, of course. I will tell you in 2 sentences.
Absorbing
Yeah,
a lot of
if you allow me to speak, I will. Do you give me permission to speak?
Yes, yes, yes.
You don't hear. You
All
don't
right.
hear.
Right. So I wanted to show you the form of Wittgenstein's thought in his early book. And that thought begins with the world, and then how one can build up language to talk about the world. And that and he realizes that as he builds up language to talk about the world, such as the language of Principia Mathematica, that it is incomplete in that what is said is larger than what can be written down, and you have to allow the language to show itself, and therefore you must have silence along with the speech, and ends with, whereof one cannot speak, one must be silent. That is a rough and quick description of Wittgenstein. Then what I did in my talk was I went through quickly chanting some of the Tractatus, going up from the world is everything is that is the case, up through to whereof one cannot speak, one must remain silent. And then I could have stopped and said, there is my present picture of Wittgenstein, and we would like to talk about Wittgenstein. And here is a laying out of the early Wittgenstein. If you wish to talk about the later Wittgenstein in relation to the earlier, or what his ideas have relevant to the present time, this should be helpful. So that's number one. Number two is that I happen to be interested, very interested in Spencer Brown's work, which begins with nothing and ends up with the world, goes in the opposite direction, and does that through the construction of language. So it's not really different from Wittgenstein. It's like going through Wittgenstein backwards. And I wanted to show you in what sense that is happening. And at this point, I know that I'm asking a lot because you may not be familiar with laws of form. You may be, almost everyone educated people are familiar with the ideas of Wittgenstein. Not everyone is familiar with laws of form, and certainly not with the formalism. So if in the last part it sounded a little too fast, I apologize, but I wanted to show you how Spencer Brown begins with nothing. Then he says, make a distinction. You make a distinction, you make a mark or a sign, and now signs have emerged. And once signs have emerged, then you start dealing with signs and how they make distinctions. You find yourself creating language. And so you pull yourself up on your bootstraps, and instead of starting with the world, you begin with language, and then you see how language is related to your worlds. And of course, it's not a straight arrow going forward, nor is Wittgenstein a straight arrow going in his direction.
Mm-hmm. More questions?
Yes. I would like to make a stab at a different interpretation.
Good.
To what Lou said. And my different interpretation would be something along as follows: that the game of mathematics, as played within the mind of the individual mathematician, is a game of symbolism. And these symbols are internal to the mind of that mathematician, and that can be demonstrated by transferring them into a different symbol system that we call words or alphabets or languages. And that this translation from the internal language, internal thoughts of the mathematician into the semantics of communication in a natural human form is limited in what it can express. And that expression is limited to the meaning that that individual has given to those symbols. This should be distinguished from atomic logic, where the atomic symbols of Rutherford are used to define numbers, and where the use of numbers in the assignment of meaning to the real world is translated into an internal symbol system and internal logic that differs from that which Lou refers to. And I'll stop right there, but I think there is here a big question in my mind of how the various symbol systems that are used to communicate, how are the angels speaking to one another would be another way of looking at it, in the sense of how different symbol systems are used. And this is radically different in the natural sciences versus that in mathematics.
Well, let me talk to the first part. The symbols of mathematics are developed through our interaction with the world. For example, people notched sticks in order to count. Eventually, they developed numerals, Roman numerals or Arabic numerals, all these different mathematical symbols. They aren't internal to the mind. They're part of the language. And the fact that the mathematicians develop a whole bunch of symbols and forms which are separated from ordinary language is just a technicality, really. They all stand for certain kinds of distinctions. They're really all part of language, and the mathematical language goes continuously through to ordinary language, but it becomes a difficulty when it becomes technical, and you may be facing, for example, the difference between your idea and a very carefully written computer program, for example, or a deep calculation. Then you have differences in language, but the differences in language that we face are always there. The difference between Arabic and Hebrew, the difference between English and Russian. Language differences are part and parcel of our need to communicate. And they're all based on what kind of distinctions are people making.
I fully concur with what you just said, with one small exception. And that is, it's not just a matter of the mathematical symbols being a technicality. They are the essence of mathematics.
Oh, yes, they're the essence, because in the mathematics, you actually need to write condensed symbols in order to think. Those symbols are part of your thinking. You invent them, or someone invented this beautiful symbolism, and it enabled you to think in a new way. And this can be, and we intend, generally mathematicians intend to share the best of that. They keep trying in educating people to mathematics. And the educated person of today knows algebra, for example. In the 1500s, even the best mathematicians didn't know algebra, and they had to solve cubic equations without it.
Gerald, you had a question?
It was actually more like a waving of the hands, but if I may ask a question, you mentioned that philosophy is an activity, which seems to assume that it's that you cannot assign a function of true and false.
Remember, I didn't say that, but Ludwig said that.
Oh, sorry, could you help me explain, does that mean that philosophy is that part which is the incomplete that you're talking about?
Should I channel Wittgenstein or what? I'm not sure. As I understand early Wittgenstein, he says philosophy is not meant to be a theory like a natural science. It's meant to be elucidation. Philosophy, the philosopher should help you or help himself clarify the what is being said or what is being asked. And if in that clarification, he also said, remember, the purpose of philosophy is to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle.
Yeah, but a lot of philosophers just close the bottle and let the fly get confused.
I'm afraid so, yeah.
Okay, for time-wise, if you have more questions for Lou, we can continue this later after all the presentation. Now Lou had compared with Spencer Brown, and Chang is going to talk about Wittgenstein and Chomsky. Okay, so Chang, floor is yours.
Okay. So
Thank you, everyone, for listening, by the way.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you. Very good. So now first to share, right? Share screen.
Yeah, share screen.
Share screen. So do you see?